All right, welcome back to episode 2 of Fantasy Bankroll. I'm your host, Robert Banker. Thank you to everybody who checked out the first episode, as well as all the new subscribers. And if you haven't yet, please subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss out when there's a new video drop. And please leave me a comment, let me know what you thought about the episodes, as well as any fantasy football topics you want to talk about this season. All right, just like last episode, we're going to take a quick look back and see how the running backs finished up the 2024 season. See who were the disappointments and who were the surprises. Let's take a look. Let's talk about some surprises, both good and bad. Bucky Irving was a huge surprise. At the beginning of the season, he was ranked as RB51 and looking to be a complimentary back to Rachaad White, before he burst onto the scene with over 1,500 total yards and finished the season ranked as RB13. Another surprise was Chuba Hubbard. Going into the season, he was ranked as RB38 before ending up in the top 15 with 1,366 total yards and 11 touchdowns, and that's with him missing the final 2 games of the year. And how can you talk surprises at the running back position without mentioning Chase Brown? Coming into the season, he was ranked as RB33 and splitting carries with Zach Moss. But once Moss was injured and he took over full-time, he was a top 5 fantasy running back the rest of the way, finishing as RB10 on the season. Now, who were some of the disappointments in fantasy last year? Breeland Hall was a big letdown last season. A lot of that was based on his ADP. He was going in the first round as RB2, before finishing as RB16. Now, some of the lack of production was due to the Jets' offense being ranked 24th, and being behind late in games obviously forced more passes than rushing attempts. Now, one of our surprises directly affected one of our letdowns. Coming off his second season in which he had over 1,500 total yards, Rachaad White was talked about as a potential fantasy star going into last season, with some expecting him to even finish in the top 10. But unfortunately for White, the breakout for the Bucs wasn't him, but instead Bucky Irving, with White finishing as RB23. Travis Etienne was being drafted as RB11 last season, coming off 2 straight seasons of 1,400 plus total yards. But last season was a huge letdown for fantasy GMs that took him early, getting just over 800 yards and 2 total touchdowns on the year, before he finished as RB35. It's tough to say someone who finished the season as RB12 was a letdown, but there's one question Jonathan Taylor has to continue to answer, and that is, can he stay healthy for an entire season? When he plays, he's produced at an elite level, but he's only played a full season one time in his career. And as a fantasy GM, it's tough to pick someone in the first or second round who might not play half the games. It's tough to mention letdowns last season at the running back position and not mention Christian McCaffrey. McCaffrey finished the 2023 season with 2,023 yards and 21 total touchdowns. But what did you get from him in the 2024 campaign? Only 50 rushing attempts for 202 yards and no touchdowns. And where you're used to getting 50 plus catches from McCaffrey, you only got 15 last year. His total yards for the year was 348, almost 1,700 less than the year before. And similar to Breeland Hall, when you're picking that high, you expect a lot more out of those players. All right, that's how the running backs finished up the 2024 season, and you could say it was a changing of the guard, with 6 new players finishing in the top 10 from 2023. Later in the episode, we'll take a look at the rookie running backs and see if there's any young guns slated to join those players for next season. Now, last episode I talked about a draft tool I use called my scoring tiers to help show where the scoring averages drop off for each position. Now let's take a look at the running back scoring tiers. If you saw my quarterback tier breakdown in episode 1, then you know the tiers are grouped into 5 players. Same thing with the running back tiers. Tier 1 is running backs 1 through 5, Tier 2, running backs 6 through 10, and so on. One thing you'll notice when taking a look at the running back tier list, there's Tier 1 running backs, and then there's everybody else. Now that might be a little dramatic, but the point drop off from Tier 1 to Tier 2 is 69 points.
69, dudes!
And the rest of the point drop offs for the following tiers are all in their 20s, meaning that moving from tier to tier, you're only losing out on an average of 20-something points for the year. Now, it's up to you as a fantasy GM to figure out where to target those other tier of running backs if you miss out on the top tier. Do you try and go for 2 Tier 2 guys? Or do you try and get a Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4 guy to make up for all of that? Again, the tier list is just a tool to help show you where the point drop-offs are so that you can make a better decision during your draft on when you should go after certain positions and when you can feel more comfortable passing for the next tier. As I mentioned with the quarterback tier list, you'll have a better overall picture once you have all the tier lists together. So make sure you check those out in the next few episodes so you have the complete list. All right, that was the running back scoring tiers. Now, as I continue to mention, the scoring tier lists work best when you have them all together and when combined with other information during your fantasy drafts. So it looks like you need to tune in for the next few weeks so you have the complete list. Now let's take a look at some of the top rookie running backs coming in this year and see if there's any that'll be worthy of your time during your fantasy drafts. All right, let's take a look at the first 10 running backs drafted in last month's NFL draft. This class was headlined by human highlight reel Ashton Jeanty, going with the 6th pick in the first round to the Las Vegas Raiders. but we'll talk more about him during the way too early rankings. The only other running back going in the first round was Omarion Hampton from North Carolina, going to the Los Angeles Chargers with the 22nd pick in the first round. Barring some unforeseen changes, Hampton should be splitting carries this season with Najee Harris, who has rushed for over 1,000 yards every season he's been in the league. However, his 3.9 yards per carry is extremely low for what you'd like from your lead back. And when you compare that with Hampton's career 5.7 yards per carry, granted that's from college, I'd expect Hampton's athleticism to shine, and for him to get more carries as the year goes on and he gets more comfortable in the offense. Next was Quinshon Judkins, going with the 4th pick in the second round of the Cleveland Browns. Judkins will most likely start the season behind Jerome Ford, who had an outstanding 5.4 yards per carry in 2024. But I wouldn't expect it to stay that way for very long. And Judkins should end up in the 150 to 175 carry range for the season. 2 picks later in the second round, Travion Henderson went to the New England Patriots. Now I like what he brings to the running back room, but there are some talented players in there with him. With Antonio Gibson, who rushed for 538 yards last season, and Ramondre Stevenson, who rushed for 801 yards last season. The team does have an out in Gibson's contract, so he could be a trade candidate or unlikely camp cut candidate. But then again, the Patriots aren't hurting for money, so the $4.75 million savings wouldn't move the needle much. Also going in the second round with the 28th pick was R.J. Harvey to the Denver Broncos. Harvey could be a late round sleeper for your fantasy team. The Broncos do have Jaleel McLaughlin, but I think he showed he was more suited for a support role last season. The team also has Audric Estime, who's a bigger back, which gives them a different option for short yardage and goal line carries. But with the uncertainty and lack of production, Harvey could step into a role early and make a late round gamble pay off for fantasy GMs. The only running back taken in the third round was Caleb Johnson, going to the Pittsburgh Steelers with the 19th pick. Johnson could see some time early for the Steelers, and it wouldn't be crazy to think he takes over the lead role before the end of the season. Jaylen Warren has been a solid option for the Steelers in his 3 seasons, but he hasn't shown that he can handle the lead back role by himself, which could lead to a split in carries early on while Johnson gets things figured out before taking over later in the season. Rounding out the top 10 running backs taken in last month's draft, we have a quartet of 4th rounders, with Bashal Tutin going to the Jacksonville Jaguars with the second pick in the 4th round, Cam Scatterbo going to the New York Giants with the 3rd pick in the 4th round, Trevor Etienne going to the Carolina Panthers with the 12th pick in the 4th round, and Woody Marks going to the Houston Texans with the 14th pick in the 4th round. Of that last group, if there's one late round or undrafted free agent fantasy running back sleeper that I'm looking at, it's Woody Marks down in Houston. He's currently behind Joe Mixon and Dameon Pierce, but he surprisingly has a lot of tread left considering his 5 years in college he only had 608 total carries, whereas this year's top back, Ashton Jeanty, had 750 carries in just 3 years. Mixon has been known to miss some games, playing in a full season only twice during his 8-year career, and Pierce hasn't shown much since he looked good filling in during his rookie season. All that being said, there's a good chance that Marks gets more touches than he's currently projected to get, and rewards fantasy GMs for taking him late. All right, that was some of the top rookie running backs in this year's draft. Do you think any of them will surprise and finish in the top 15 scorers overall? Now, it's still a little early to know what everyone's roles will be in their offense, but once we get a little bit closer, we'll take a look and see who's going to be a worthy fantasy option for your team this year. Now, let's take a look at the way too early 2025 rankings for running backs and see where everyone's stacked 4 months before the season starts. Number 15, Breece Hall. After finishing 2023 as RB2, Hall's numbers took a bit of a dip last season. His rushing attempts, both rushing and receiving yards, and touchdowns were all down in a season that saw him put up 876 yards and 5 touchdowns on the ground, to go along with 473 yards and 3 touchdowns on 57 receptions. The Jets trailed early, which leads to less rushing attempts, and this resulted in them having the least amount of rushing attempts in the league with 363. Now let's take a look and see at the averages you've gotten from Hall over his 3 years. Taking out his rookie year that saw Hall splitting touches, he's been more than a solid fantasy option, as you heard finishing as RB2 in 2023, and just outside the top 15 last year at RB16. For his 2 years as a starter, he's given you an average of 935 yards and 5 touchdowns on the ground, to go along with 66 receptions for 537 yards and 3 touchdowns through the air. If he can hit the 1,000-yard mark on the ground, keep his reception numbers up over 50, and get better play around him, he should be a target early during your fantasy drafts. Number 14, Joe Mixon. All right, Mixon's first year in Houston was a good one. He rushed for just over 1,000 yards and 11 touchdowns. Those 11 touchdowns were the second most of his career. He also added 36 receptions for 306 yards and 1 touchdown through the air. He did miss 3 games with injuries, which is something Mixon's dealt with, playing a full season only twice in his 8 years in the league. But let's take a look and see what fantasy GMs can expect from Mixon this year. For his career, when playing at least 14 games, Mixon has given fantasy owners 1,062 yards and almost 9 touchdowns on the ground, while also adding 337 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. There isn't much competition for Mixon down in Houston, so if he can stay healthy, he should see a good workload again this season, finishing somewhere between 270 and 290 touches for the season. Once again, making him a solid option for your fantasy team.
Number 13, Jonathan Taylor.
Alright, last season was closer to what fantasy owners have come to expect from Jonathan Taylor since he came into the league in 2019. He rushed for 1,431 yards and 11 touchdowns. Now, it was the lowest receiving totals of his career, with 18 catches for 136 yards and 1 touchdown, but his 1,567 total scrimmage yards was good enough for 7th in the league, and that's with missing 3 games. So let's see what a healthy JT brings to your fantasy roster this year. When playing in 13 games or more in a season, Taylor has easily been a top 10 back, averaging 1,470 yards and over 13 touchdowns on the ground, as well as 31 receptions and a touchdown through the air. He did miss those 3 games I mentioned, but overall he had a bounce-back season after missing half the year in 2023. The team brought over Khalil Herbert from Cincinnati and picked up DJ Giddens in the draft, but neither one should affect what a healthy Taylor brings your fantasy roster.
Number 12, Ashton Jeanty.
The 6th pick in this year's draft, Genty will immediately jump into the lead back role for the Raiders, and I'd expect him to easily get 225 or more carries and 30 to 40 targets on the season. The team did sign Raheem Mostert from the Dolphins, but he's coming off his lowest rushing totals in 3 seasons, and he'll mainly serve as the backup. Now let's take a look at some of those ridiculous numbers that Genty put up while he was at Boise State. Everyone's seen the highlights and what Genty can do with the ball in his hand, but in case you somehow missed it last season, he rushed for 2,601 yards and a ridiculous 29 touchdowns. 29!
That's crazy!
Boise State didn't ask him to make many receptions this year, only pulling in 23 catches for 138 yards and 1 touchdown. But let's look at his 3-year averages for the Broncos. He averaged 1,590 yards and 17 touchdowns on the ground, and 27 receptions and 287 yards and 2 touchdowns receiving. Genty looks poised to join the top tier of fantasy running backs, so you'll want to snag him early if you can.
Number 11, James Cook.
Cook actually rushed for more yards in 2023 than he did last season. However, the big difference fantasy-wise was that he rushed for 14 more touchdowns than he did the year prior, leading the league with 16 touchdowns on the ground with just over 1,000 yards. He also added 32 receptions for 258 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. Those 18 total touchdowns were good enough for 3rd best in the league for non-quarterbacks. Now let's see what kind of production Cook has brought to your fantasy roster since he came into the league. Not including his rookie season, where he didn't start any games and barely had 100 total touches. Through 2 seasons, Cook has given you an average of 1,066 yards and 9 touchdowns on the ground. Now the touchdowns are skewed slightly because, as you heard, 16 of those rushing touchdowns were last season. And while you might not be able to expect 16 rushing touchdowns per year, I think you can easily expect more than the 2 he had in 2023. As far as receiving goes, during those 2 years, Cook has averaged 34 receptions for 358 yards and 3 touchdowns through the air. Those receiving numbers put him just below what I consider the threshold for the top tier of fantasy running backs. That being said, if your rushing touchdown total is in the teens, you can definitely make up for some of the missed production in the passing game. Either way, Cook should be a top fantasy running back option this season.
Number 10, Christian McCaffrey.
last season was a letdown from the high standards we've gotten used to from McCaffrey when he's healthy. He missed games to start the season while rehabbing off-season surgery, and ended up only playing in 4 games before going on season-ending IR, which I'm sure was really great for fantasy GMs who had him as a keeper. Not that I'd know or anything. But when he is healthy, he's elite. So let's take a look at the numbers that he brings to your fantasy team. If I told you a player averaged 93 receptions, 794 yards, and 5 touchdowns receiving per season when healthy, you'd think that was a decent wide receiver too. But those are actually Christian McCaffrey's receiving numbers when he's been healthy. But that's just it. It's been a tale of 2 CMCs. One that plays and is easily a top 3 fantasy running back option, where in addition to those receiving numbers that I mentioned, he's also averaged 1,270 yards and 11 touchdowns on the ground. The good news is that after one of those disappointing seasons last year, dealing with 2 different injuries, one to his Achilles and one to his PCL, all reports are he's healthy and ready to go for the 2025 season. And I'm sure McCaffrey and fantasy GMs everywhere will hope that he can bounce back to his previous form.
Number 9. Josh Jacobs.
Jacobs enjoyed a great first year in Green Bay, rushing for 1,329 yards, the second most of his career, and 15 touchdowns, the most of his career. He also hauled in 36 passes for 342 yards and 1 touchdown through the air. It's safe to say Jacobs was a good fit in the Packers offense, as he handled the second most touches of his career, and he rewarded fantasy GMs, as you saw in the recap, with an RB6 finish. Now let's take a look and see what Jacobs has given you historically as a fantasy GM. Jacobs has been a workhorse during his career, averaging around 306 total touches per season, for an average of almost 1,300 yards and 11 touchdowns on the ground, while also snagging you around 44 catches for 298 yards through the air as well. I have Jacobs just outside my top tier fantasy running backs because he's only hit the 50 reception mark twice in a season, and despite having a good amount of catches, he only has a receiving touchdown for his career, as in 1, ever. Although it was last season, so you never know. No matter what, if his numbers can stay close to what he's averaged for his career, you'll definitely want to snag Jacobs in your fantasy draft.
Number 8. Bucky Irving.
Mayfield to Bucky Irving. We've said that a bunch today. Irving slipping tackles. We've said that a bunch today. And look at Irving go. Trying to turn it upfield and caught from behind. Close to
I'm
me.
really excited to see what Irving can do going into his second season, and with what should certainly be more opportunities, considering for 7 of the first 9 weeks last year, he was only receiving single-digit carries. And despite that, he still managed to rush for 1,122 yards and 8 touchdowns. And although he didn't find the end zone, he still hauled in 47 passes for 392 yards. And going into this year as the clear-cut lead back, Irving's positioned to have an even better sophomore season. Over the last 8 weeks of the season, Irving averaged 115 total yards per game, and that included a game against the Raiders in which he only had 4 carries for 3 yards and 1 catch for 15 yards. Also during that time, he received double-digit carries in all but 1 game. Irving clearly took over as the lead back midway through last season, and looking at the averages from that point on, his numbers for a full season project to 1,496 rushing yards and 459 yards through the air, which any fantasy GM will take.
Number 7. Chase Brown.
On average, Brown was the 35th running back taken in fantasy drafts last year, and for much of the season that position looked correct. But after Zach Moss was injured in Week 8 and he took over full-time, he was a top 10 scorer in 6 of 8 weeks, 4 of which were in the top 5, before finishing the season with just under 1,000 yards and 7 touchdowns on the ground. And he was just as dynamic through the air, pulling in 54 passes for 360 yards and 4 touchdowns. Now let's see what those type of numbers project to for a full season for your fantasy team. Brown had a total of 14 carries and 5 catches for the first 3 weeks of the season. But it was after Zach Moss was injured in Week 8 that Brown began to really show what he could do with the full workload, averaging 24 touches per game for 79 yards rushing, 37 receiving yards, and 1 touchdown per game. Brown's numbers for a full season would project around 1,343 rushing yards and 9 touchdowns on the ground, and over 70 receptions and 600 yards to go along with 5 touchdowns receiving. Those numbers would put him in my top tier of fantasy running backs, and if you're getting anything close to that for your fantasy team, you'll take it every day of the week.
Number 6. Kairen Williams.
Kairen handled the third most carries in the NFL last year with 316, and he turned that into 1,299 yards and 14 touchdowns on the ground. And he also hauled in 34 passes for 182 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. But his 4.1 yards per carry was by far the lowest in the top 10, and significantly down from his 2023 average of 5 yards per carry. But that type of volume is always going to be attractive in fantasy, and a big reason why he's finished his RB7 in back-to-back years. So let's see what that type of volume will bring to your fantasy team. Williams has been incredibly consistent during the past 2 seasons, averaging 1,221 yards and 13 touchdowns on the ground, and 33 receptions and 194 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. He finished 19th in 2023 before climbing up to a 7th place finish last season. Fantasy GMs would love to see Williams' average per carry get back up closer to the 5 yards per carry he had during his first year as a starter. And if he can do that while adding a few more receptions, getting him closer to the 45 to 50 range, Williams could finish even higher in the 2025 season.
Number 5. De'Von Achane.
Achane had a good rookie year, but he took over the lead back role last year and got 100 more carries and pulled in 51 more receptions to the tune of 907 yards and 6 touchdowns on the ground and 592 yards and 6 touchdowns through the air. Before, as you saw in the recap, he finished as RB5. Now as the clear-cut RB1 in Miami, Achane's clearly positioned for a top 5 fantasy finish again this season. Now let's take a quick look back at Achane's first 2 years in Miami. Achane is still young, going into only his 3rd season, but he's given fantasy GMs a consistent running back during his first 2 years, averaging 853 yards and 7 touchdowns rushing, and adding 395 yards and 4 touchdowns receiving. Although, as I mentioned, he added 50 more receptions and 400 more yards in his 2nd season. And despite finishing ranked 21st in rushing yards, as you saw in the recap, he still managed to finish the season as the 5th ranked fantasy running back. And even if he maintains similar receiving numbers for the 2025 season, if he can get his rushing yards into the 12 to 1,400 yard range, he should easily finish the 2025 season as a top fantasy running back.
Number 4. Derrick Henry.
Henry's first year in Baltimore was exactly what the Ravens envisioned when they signed him in free agency. He rushed for 1,921 yards and 16 touchdowns on the ground, and he added 19 catches for 193 yards and 2 touchdowns through the air. Those 18 total touchdowns were tied with James Cook for 2nd in the league. Henry fit right in with Baltimore's offense, and going into year 2 with the Ravens, there's no reason to think that things changed this season. Now let's take a look at the ridiculous stats that Henry's brought to your fantasy team during his career. 5th, 3rd, 4th, 8th, and 4th. Minus 2021 when he was injured and only played in 8 games. Those are the fantasy finishes for Henry over the last 6 seasons. Those finishes are in large part due to numbers like his average of 1,492 rushing yards and 13 touchdowns on the ground during that time. And while he won't give you a lot in the way of receptions, 33 being his career high in 2022, he's averaged just 22 per season since coming into the league. Those rushing stats have made up for the lack of receiving prowess on Henry's part, where he's provided double-digit rushing touchdowns in 7 straight seasons.
Number 3. Saquan Barkley.
After spending his first 6 seasons in New York, it's safe to say that his first season with the Eagles was a resounding hit. Barkley had the most carries of his career with 345, which he turned into 2,005 yards and 13 touchdowns on the ground, to go along with 33 catches for 278 yards and 2 touchdowns receiving. It wasn't the most targets or receptions of his career, but it was his best catch percentage and yards per target. And if he wants to finish in the top 3 again, he's going to have to take full advantage of those targets. Now let's take a look at the career averages that Barkley's brought to your team. It's not like Barkley hasn't been a top fantasy running back option since he entered the league. Last season wasn't even the first time in his career that he broke the 2,000 total yard barrier. For his career when healthy, he's given fantasy owners an average of 1,197 yards and 8 touchdowns on the ground, to go along with 386 receiving yards and just over 2 touchdowns through the air. As I mentioned, he handled the most carries of his career last season, and if he gets a little closer to the 91 receptions he had his rookie year, he'll easily finish as a top 5 scoring running back again this season.
Number 2. Jahmyr Gibbs.
Gibbs was easily one of the top fantasy running backs last season, finishing with 1,412 yards and 16 touchdowns on the ground, to go along with 52 receptions for 517 yards and 4 touchdowns through the air, bringing his total touchdowns to a ridiculous 20. And believe it or not, Gibbs was actually peaking to end the year, where he was averaging 121 rushing yards, 41 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns per game. Now let's take a look at his crazy averages he's brought to your fantasy team. Gibbs is someone you can definitely call an all-around back. While the stats say he technically hasn't started many games, only 4 last season and 3 his rookie year, he's more than produced like someone who's not only starting, but like someone who's not coming out of the game very often. Gibbs has averaged 230 carries for 1,252 yards and 14 touchdowns on the ground, and 55 catches for 443 yards and 3 touchdowns through the air during his first 2 seasons. Putting him into the elite fantasy back category that's going to give you both carries and more than 50 receptions in a season. Again, those are top tier fantasy running back numbers, and the reason you'll want to snag Gibbs in your draft if you can.
Number 1, Bejan Robinson.
Two seasons into his career, Bejan Robinson already ascended into a top-tier fantasy running back option. Last season, he rushed for 1,456 yards and 14 touchdowns on the ground. But what really makes him one of the elite guys is his added receiving component. He pulled in 61 catches on 72 targets last year for 431 yards. And he only had 1 receiving touchdown after 4 his rookie season, so you'd like to see that a little bit higher. But when you've got 15 total touchdowns, it's hard to complain. Now let's look at some of those elite stats that Robinson's brought to your fantasy team since he's been in the league. As I mentioned, it's only been 2 years, but fantasy GMs have gotten stellar play from Robinson since he came into the league. How stellar? How does 1,216 yards rushing and 459 yards receiving with 11 total touchdowns per season sound? Last year, he had almost 100 more touches than his rookie year with 365. And for an all-around back like Robinson, I'd fully expect that number to stay the same or even go up a little bit for the 2025 season. And as a fantasy GM, the more your players can touch the ball, the better. And one of the main reasons that I have Bejan Robinson ranked as the number 1 fantasy running back in my way too early rankings for the 2025 season. Okay, that was my way too early running back rankings for the 2025 season. Let me know in the comments what you thought. What would you do differently? What are your rankings right now? All right, that'll do it for this episode of Fantasy Bankroll. Thank you so much for checking it out. If you haven't yet, please go check out last episode where we took a look at the quarterbacks. And please tune in for next episode where we'll be looking at the wide receivers. And please like and subscribe and hit that notification bell. And let's keep getting ready for this fantasy season together. Let's go!